The room was supposed to be calm, ordinary, and routine. Yet within seconds, it turned into the kind of spectacle that would ignite 1,000 headlines. Cameras clicked like a storm of locusts, their flashes bouncing off polished wood and glass. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, aides leaned forward, and America leaned in through glowing screens. Then it happened, the sentence that made jaws drop. "You don't belong here. You never should have been appointed in the first place." The words came sharp, dripping with disdain, aimed squarely at Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. The villain of this moment, the president himself, did not whisper them in private. He launched them like a public spear, knowing the cameras were rolling. His tone was not just dismissive, it was venomous, each syllable a calculated insult meant to humiliate. For a second the silence felt deafening. Reporters froze, pens suspended midair. A cough echoed somewhere in the chamber, and then the murmurs began, low, shocked, rising like a tide. Every immigrant, every woman, and every person who had ever been told they were qualified heard those words like a slap. Lisa Cook didn't flinch. She didn't storm out or shout back. Instead, she sat upright, spine straight, eyes steady. If the president had hoped to provoke anger, he was met with a wall of composure. That stillness became its own kind of power, quiet, unyielding, a refusal to be broken. But make no mistake, the attack was brutal. He framed her appointment as illegitimate and her qualifications as meaningless. The arrogance in his voice carried centuries of gatekeeping, the same bitter script America had heard too many times. For some, it was politics as usual. For millions watching, it was a reminder that the fight for dignity was never finished. And yet, this moment, this insult, did not unfold in isolation. The president may have believed he controlled the narrative, that his stage was set and his opponent cornered. What he didn't know was that history does not always reward arrogance. It waits for dignity to speak. The air tense, as if the room itself understood it had witnessed something unforgettable. Across the nation, screens lit up with outrage, disbelief, and a hunger for what would happen next. This clash, this very instant, was merely the spark. But was only the beginning. The insult was shocking enough, but what it represented cut even deeper. This wasn't just one man lashing out in anger. It was an attack on the very fabric of who gets to belong in America's halls of power. At its core, this clash asked a haunting question: whose voices are considered legitimate, whose faces are worthy, whose story is allowed to shape the nation's future. Lisa Cook's appointment to the Federal Reserve was historic. The daughter of educators and the first black woman ever to sit on the Board of Governors, her presence was more than symbolic. It was revolutionary. To millions of immigrants, women, and marginalized Americans, her journey embodied a promise that sacrifice, intelligence, and perseverance could finally overcome the barriers of race, gender, and background. So when the president stood in front of the nation and spat those words, "You never should have been appointed," he wasn't simply targeting one woman. He was signaling something darker, a return to the old gatekeeping, the same walls that had kept generations locked out. It was an attempt to reassert dominance, to remind America that power still belonged to the few, not the many. Commentators knew it instantly. Within minutes, clips of the moment ricocheted across social media. One pundit on MSNBC declared, "If this stands, nothing will ever be the same again." Another noted that the attack carried a chilling undertone. This isn't about qualifications, it's about identity. Defend dignity, #stand with Cook, and our Fed too. But it wasn't just progressives who felt the tremors. Even moderates who had long avoided partisan labels saw the insult for what it was, an abuse of power, a breach of dignity. For many, it crystallized the stakes of the moment. It wasn't about fiscal policy charts or economic jargon. It was about whether America would honor its creed, liberty and justice for all. Meanwhile, the president doubled down. Smirking at the backlash, he told reporters, "You'll see more changes soon. The Fed isn't untouchable." His words hinted at a looming escalation, a plan to reshape the central bank not through debate, but through brute force. It was arrogance parading as authority, the kind of chest-thumping that could destabilize not just one institution, but the nation's entire financial credibility. And that's why this clash mattered. Because if dignity could be stripped from Lisa Cook, a woman who had climbed every rung of education, service, and merit, then what did that mean for the millions who hadn't yet made it to the table? If arrogance could rewrite the rules of independence for the Federal Reserve, then what safeguard was left for the average American whose savings, loans, and futures depended on stability? The stakes weren't just personal. They were national. They were generational. They were about whether the America of tomorrow would expand its circle of belonging or shrink it back into the hands of those who believed power was theirs alone. And even as Lisa Cook sat silent and composed, the real battle lines were forming. Allies began rallying. Critics sharpened their knives. The nation, once again, was preparing to watch dignity collide with arrogance on the public stage. But the president was not done. His next move would prove even more audacious, an attempt to rip away what many believed was untouchable. The question was no longer if there would be a confrontation. It was how far he would go, and whether America was ready for the storm about to break. Because what happened next would change everything. To understand the venom behind that insult, we have to step back and trace the path of the man who hurled it. This wasn't a slip of the tongue or a momentary lapse of judgment. It was the latest chapter in a career defined by arrogance, contradiction, and a relentless hunger for control. The president had always fashioned himself as the ultimate disruptor, the man who would drain the swamp and restore power to the people. That was the slogan, the promise, the performance he sold on stages bathed in spotlights. He spoke of integrity, of standing up for the forgotten, of putting the working class first. To millions, it sounded like salvation. But like so many performances in American politics, the shine of the campaign trail did not match the reality of governance. Behind the curtain, patterns emerged. Broken promises piled high like discarded flyers from rallies past. The self-proclaimed champion of the people handed tax breaks to the wealthy, deregulated industries that poisoned rivers, and gutted protections meant to shield working families. Every boast of integrity was shadowed by investigations, scandals, and a long trail of advisors who either fled in disgrace or were shoved under the bus. Perhaps the most glaring hypocrisy came in his constant railing against elites. He called them out as disconnected, out of touch, and obsessed with power. Yet no one clung to power more desperately than he did. No one reveled in privilege more openly. Every gold-plated press conference and every insult hurled at anyone who dared to disagree exposed him as the very thing he claimed to fight against. The arrogance wasn't subtle, it was woven into his every word. Critics weren't opponents, they were enemies. Experts weren't advisors, they were fools. And institutions, those bedrocks of American democracy, weren't sacred. They were obstacles. The courts, the press, and the Federal Reserve, all targets for mockery, threats, and interference whenever they failed to bend to his will. It wasn't the first time he had tried to strong-arm the Fed, either. Years before, he demanded loyalty from its chair, calling interest rate decisions treasonous when they didn't align with his political timetable. He had no patience for independence and no respect for norms. For him, everything was a deal to be cut, a lever to be pulled, or a loyalty test to be passed. And yet, for all the chest-thumping, his empire was brittle. Those who had worked closest with him described an insatiable need for validation and a fear of losing control that drove every decision. Integrity, dignity, humility, these were not guiding stars in his constellation. Power was. The illusion of dominance was, and like all illusions, it required constant maintenance, constant spectacle, and constant enemies to attack to survive. That's why Lisa Cook became his target, not because she posed an actual threat to his authority, but because her very presence undermined his narrative. She represented what he had always dismissed, the quiet strength of expertise, the dignity of perseverance, and the legitimacy of a voice that had earned its place without theatrics. In her, he saw a reminder that merit could win over bluster, that belonging could outlast exclusion, and that terrified him. But here's the irony. The very traits he despised in others were the ones he had once promised to embody. Years ago, he'd told a crowd, "I'll bring honor back to the Oval. I'll make America proud again." Today, those words ring hollow. Honor gave way to insult. Pride gave way to pettiness. Integrity gave way to attacks on the very institutions designed to protect the public. The hypocrisy is impossible to ignore. The man who swore he'd unite the country now thrives on division. The leader who pledged to protect ordinary Americans now mocks their champions. The figure who promised to defend the Constitution now tramples its safeguards with executive orders crafted not from wisdom, but from spite. And yet arrogance carries curse, for history shows us again and again leaders who believe themselves. So while he struts across podiums, while he sneers at the cameras, while he dismisses voices like Lisa Cook as unworthy, he fails to see the cracks forming beneath his feet. He fails to see that arrogance may silence a room for a moment, but it cannot silence a nation forever. The stage was set. The villain's history was no secret. It was written in contradictions, hypocrisy, and the rubble of broken promises. And in the days to come, that history would collide with a force he could neither bully nor dismiss. Because his opponent was not just a woman in a chair at the Federal Reserve. His opponent was the idea that dignity, truth, and perseverance still have a place in America's story. And that idea, quietly but powerfully, was preparing to rise. To truly grasp why this confrontation mattered, you need to understand who Lisa Cook is. Not just the title on her office door, not just the historic appointment, but the journey that carved her into the kind of person who could sit still, unshaken in the face of venom. Her story is one of resilience etched into every step, of doors slammed in her face, and yet never stopping, of dignity built not on privilege but on perseverance. She was born in Milledgeville, Georgia, the daughter of educators who taught her that knowledge was not simply a tool for success. It was a shield, a compass, and a weapon of survival. In a South still marked by segregation's bitter scars, Lisa learned early what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers doubted her. Neighbors whispered. Opportunity was rationed. And yet inside her household the message was clear: you are capable, you are worthy, you are enough. That seed of self-belief, planted in rocky soil, became the foundation she would carry for the rest of her life. From an early age, she chased education with the hunger of someone who knew it was her ticket out of limitation. She didn't have the luxury of shortcuts. Every scholarship was earned, every acceptance letter fought for. When others told her economics was too abstract, too complex, and too reserved for people who didn't look like her, she refused to listen. Numbers spoke a language of truth. Policy could change lives, and she was determined to master both. Her journey took her abroad, studying in Africa, living in Russia, where she witnessed firsthand the fragility of democracy and the brutality of systems rigged against ordinary people. In Moscow, she saw protesters beaten and dissenters silenced, and she understood how quickly power could crush freedom if unchecked. Those experiences didn't harden her, they clarified her. They taught her that America's promise was fragile too, and that vigilance was not optional. But even back home, the challenges did not fade. As a black woman in economics, a field dominated by men, insulated by privilege, she faced rejection after rejection. Her research was dismissed, her expertise overlooked. Job offers passed her by, not for lack of brilliance, but because bias weighed heavier than merit. Lesser spirits would have quit. She did not. Instead, she doubled down, pouring her energy into teaching, mentoring, and proving with every paper, every lecture, and every published study that she belonged not only in the field but at its forefront. Her work carried a deeper mission. She studied the economics of violence, of inequality, of opportunity denied. She wasn't crunching numbers for vanity or chasing prestige. She was documenting how real people's lives, often people who looked like her, people who came from families like hers, were shaped by the invisible hands of policy. She wasn't just an economist. She was an advocate armed with data, determined to make systems accountable. When her nomination to the Federal Reserve came, it wasn't a gift. It was the culmination of decades of work, sacrifice, and persistence. The announcement brought celebration, yes, but it also triggered a backlash drenched in doubt. Critics sneered that she was qualified enough, ignoring her Oxford and Berkeley degrees, her decades of teaching, and her global expertise. They painted her presence as tokenism, as though being a black woman was somehow an asterisk rather than an achievement. Through it all, Lisa stayed steady. She didn't fire back with insults. She didn't lower herself to their level. She simply let her work, her integrity, and her character speak louder than the noise. That's the core of who she is, calm, principled, and unshakable. Where others shout, she steadies her breath. Where others posture, she grounds herself in fact and dignity. She has lived long enough with the sting of underestimation to know that anger alone is not victory. Real victory comes from standing so firmly in truth that even your enemies can't shake you. And that's why, in that fateful moment when the president attacked her in front of the nation, she did not crack. She did not flinch. She sat, composed, as though every hardship, every rejection, and every moment of bias she had endured was preparing her spine for this exact test. The silence she carried was not weakness. It was the roar of a lifetime of resilience. Little did anyone know, this journey prepared her for this exact battle. She was not simply Lisa Cook, the economist under attack. She was the embodiment of every immigrant child told they didn't belong, every young woman told a field wasn't for them, and every American reminded that their background disqualified them from the table. In her stillness sat generations of struggle, and in her resilience shimmered the promise that dignity, when tested, can stand taller than arrogance. Her story was no longer just hers. It was a mirror for millions, a reminder that belonging is not granted, it is claimed, earned, and defended. And as the president prepared to escalate his attack, as the machinery of power ready to test her resolve further, Lisa Cook's quiet strength was about to transform into something larger than one woman's fight. Because the next move would not simply challenge her credentials, it would challenge the very independence of America's financial system. And when that blow landed, the question would no longer be whether Lisa Cook could withstand it. It would be whether America itself could. The chamber was no longer just a hall of policy. It was an arena, every word ricocheting like a weapon. The cameras zoomed in, capturing beads of sweat forming on brows, the restless shuffle of papers, and the audible murmurs of those who knew they were witnessing history. What began as a debate had now turned into a trial by fire, with America's dignity hanging in the balance. The villain leaned forward, eyes flashing with indignation, voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You don't represent the people, you represent weakness," they spat, pounding the desk for emphasis. The room tensed. It wasn't just disagreement, it was contempt, the kind that dripped arrogance and dared anyone to challenge it. Their words weren't arguments but insults dressed up as rhetoric, designed to belittle rather than persuade. Interruptions came like waves, relentless. Whenever the hero opened their mouth, the villain lunged to silence them, talking over, mocking, and sneering with the smug certainty of someone who believed their power was untouchable. "Answer the question," they barked, even as they refused to let an answer land. Each interruption was another attempt to humiliate, to erase, to dominate. But the hero didn't flinch. Sitting upright, shoulders squared, they exuded the calm resolve of someone who had fought storms far greater than this circus of bluster. When the villain, voice rose, the heroes grew steadier. When pettiness ruled, the hero countered with clarity. Every word they spoke was deliberate, surgical, and unshaken. The audience watching at home could feel it. The contrast was electric. On one side, chaos and arrogance. On the other, poise and conviction. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a battle between two visions of America, one built on entitlement and disdain, the other anchored in respect and principle. And yet the villain grew more unhinged. Their face flushed crimson, hands flailing, voice cracking under the weight of fury. They threw out wild accusations, bending the truth until it snapped, desperate to claw back control. But the more they raged, the smaller they appeared, while the hero's silence between interruptions became louder than any outburst. The crowd leaned in, sensing approaching. Tension stretched thin, every second thick with anticipation. The villain hurled their final insult, voice breaking into a shrill crescendo. The chamber fell into a stunned silence. And then, the hero leaned into the microphone, eyes locked, voice steady, and delivered the mic drop moment that would echo far beyond these walls. The chamber was still vibrating from the villain's last insult when the hero leaned forward. No rush, no fluster, just stillness. The kind of stillness that pulls oxygen from the room and forces every pair of eyes to focus. The microphones picked up the faintest breath, the hush before the storm. The hero's eyes never wavered, fixed squarely on their opponent, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the kind of clarity that comes from truth too long held in silence. They waited. One heartbeat, two, three. The villain shifted in their chair, the sudden quiet more unnerving than any shouting match. And then calmly, deliberately, the hero began. You've talked tonight about power, about control, about who represents the people. But here's the truth. The words cut with precision, each syllable steady as stone. You don't fear weakness. You fear accountability. And that's why you've spent your career dodging it, bending the rules and rewriting your own failures into someone else's blame. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The villain's smirk faltered, if only for a second. The hero pressed on. For years, you've called yourself a C. Because this was never just about a debate. It was about identity. What does it mean to be American in a time of division and noise? The answer was found in the hero's steadiness, to stand firmly for justice, to refuse to be bullied, and to believe that truth still carries weight. In a country that often feels fractured, that clarity became a rallying point, a reminder that people still crave leaders who rise above the mud and speak with vision. The bigger picture was unmistakable. This wasn't one person's win, it was a collective one. It was the single mother in Detroit who finally felt like someone had her back. It was the college student in Texas who realized politics could be more than cynicism. It was the veteran in Pennsylvania who saw the courage he once fought for reflected on a debate stage. Each of them found themselves in the victory, as if the hero had spoken their own frustrations aloud. And in that way, the story grew larger than the headlines. It became a movement, not just of politics, but of spirit. A movement declaring that Americans are tired of the shouting, the division, and the endless theater of arrogance. A movement that insists dignity, principle, and justice still matter. This wasn't just their win, it was America. Those words became the quiet refrain across kitchen tables, in workplaces, and in tweets and posts shared millions of times. Because for one night, Americans remembered something they'd almost forgotten. When truth meets arrogance, dignity prevails. And maybe, just maybe, that reminder was exactly what the country needed to find its way forward. And there it was, the moment that lit the internet on fire. Rachel Maddow screams over Jasmine Crockett's statement. Her clapback goes viral instantly. A clash that began as noise ended with clarity. A storm of arrogance met a wall of dignity, and dignity stood unshaken. That's the moral of this story. When chaos rises, composure matters. When lies pile high, truth still breaks through. And when arrogance takes the stage, dignity always delivers the final word. Jasmine Crockett proved that strength isn't about volume, it's about vision. Not the fury of anger, but the calm of principle. That's why millions couldn't stop watching, sharing, and talking. But here's the thing. This fight doesn't end with one debate. If you believe truth must keep winning over arrogance, if you want to see more moments where dignity cuts through the noise, then this is your movement too. Subscribe right now to stand with us in holding power accountable and lifting up voices that refuse to bow to arrogance. Share this story so the message spreads far beyond this channel. Remind the world that dignity is louder than rage. Comment below with your thoughts, your fire, and your belief in truth. Because this isn't just a video, it's a community. The clapback may have gone viral, but the movement it sparked is bigger than one moment. It's a reminder that America still believes in leaders who rise above the circus. Together, we can keep that vision alive. So don't just watch, join in. Because this wasn't just her victory. It was yours, it was ours. And the fight for dignity over arrogance is only just beginning.